LaCloud. All right, so it's like everybody's coming in. All right, so that being said, let's go back to what I had mentioned before. Any specific questions that you guys have or anything you want to cover before we jump into the contract? All right. Well, that sounds good. Well, then what we're going to do is we're going to jump right into Form 310, which normally takes us through some great conversations over the course of the contract. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. You should see where it says Zip Forms Plus. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that. All right, great. Thank you. All right, so this is where I go as a quick reference, by the way, for really any and all of the, let me make sure I get my chat box up, sorry. In case you have any questions. All right, so I really go here for any and all the, to get to the forms quickly. You can also get it through DocuSign. You log into here with using your NRDS number, which if you don't know what that is, you can look it up through here. Makes it pretty easy to do so. And then you can just select from all the forms, South Carolina forms that we have. We're going to jump to Form 310, which is a residential agreement to buy and sell real estate. And basically what I'm going to do is go through this and work through each section of it so we can take a look at it, get any questions answered that you may have. I'll zoom in as much as possible. And really what this does is it really serves as a good way for me to use as an outline for topics that have come up over the last couple of weeks. So that makes it a little bit easier to kind of explore out on some things to be on the lookout for and that sort of thing. So, all right, everybody with me so far? If you are, give me a thumbs up, even though I can only see 3 of you. So we'll have to talk a little bit on our class etiquette with cameras, but this is a contracts class, not a class etiquette class. So, all right, so paragraph 1, section 1 in the contract. This is pretty easy. It's the definitions in the fill in the blank. This is where you're going to put the purchaser of the property as well as the person selling the property. In a perfect world, you'll have their exact names as it shows on the deed of the property. However, if you do not represent the seller, you may not have a copy of the deed. And in this market, you may not have time to track the deed down prior to submitting the offer. So in this case, you would put what is on the tax records. You could put that in there. You obviously put how you want their buyers' names to be on the contract. What's another way that you could get the information on the seller's get the seller's information to put it on the contract? This would be the participatory part of it.
Email the listing agent?
Would that be to ask the agent of the seller?
Ask the agent. I heard someone else mention emailing the agent. Yes, this is any time you don't have information for the contract is a great time to start your communication with the listing agent. Too often I see people's first communication with the listing agent is when they submit the offer. And in my opinion, particularly in this type of market, you're really missing an opportunity to start building that relationship. So make a list of things that you can call and ask the listing agent. That could be one of them. Hey, we've got a buyer that's interested in putting in an offer. You know, I show the tax records of this name. Is there anything else we need to put on there? Any terms, conditions, anything that we should look at? So yes, correct. That would be the best way to do so would be to reach out to the listing agent. Now, again, if you can't get a hold of them, go to the tax records first. That can always be corrected after you go under contract. This next part, parties. Very important. There are only 2 parties to a South Carolina real estate contract. Those 2 parties are the buyer and the seller. There are no other parties to the contract. The agents are not party to the contract. The lender is not party to the contract. The escrow agent is not party to the contract. It's important to know that for a couple of different reasons is should the agents make an agreement to adjust their commission at any time with the buyer, seller, or to kick in on this, that is not part of this contract. That is outside of this contract and should be taken in, should be dealt with in a compensation agreement. Should the lender want to do anything as it relates to contributing closing costs or anything with the buyer or on behalf of the seller, which is rare, that should also be dealt with on outside of this contract. This party is for buyers and sellers of this contract. Brokers are licensed South Carolina brokers in charge. They're associated real estate licensees and their subagents. You know, this technically spills over into the termination agreement. I know a lot of people, especially when we held earnest money. Anytime there was a release of earnest money, it says broker on there. Technically, that covers you as the agent as well. So if you do have a release from a contract, you can sign it yourself. Closing attorney would be the attorney that's representing and selected by the buyer. Effective date is the final date upon which the party to the negotiation places the final and required signatures and initials and date on the contract and delivers notice to initially cause the primary contract to be binding on all parties. And delivers notice is the big part right here, because this is also where just literally lost this. And delivers notice right here. This is also helps define when you're ratified, right? The effective date is when I send it to the sellers for final signature, and then the agent delivers notice to the buyer side that the contract has been ratified. Good funds is the required amount in the United States with any required time frame, basically that's both for termination fees, any reimbursement fees that you'd have in any of the contracts, earnest money, as well as purchase price. Time. All time stated shall be South Carolina local time. Time is of the essence with respect to all provisions of the contract stipulating time, deadline, and performance periods. Basically, all this does is reiterates that if we put a date, you have to follow it. There's no exception to it. For the old schoolers in here that were used to the 3 days, so to speak, after the closing date in the South Carolina contract, that doesn't exist anymore. And quite frankly, I'm tired of having the debate of whether or not that was a smart move or not. I personally think it was a smart move. My wife, who is a accomplished, successful buyer's agent, 100% disagrees with me. My point on this is if you have a closing date, then you have a closing date. Having 3 days to bleed over for whatever reason, then you might as well just move the closing date 3 days later. So the point is on this, though, we do have dates in here. There's really no leeway that gives you some free time in the event the closing needs to get pushed. All right, I'm going to keep going on. If you have any questions, throw them into the chat box. And as always, feel free to just speak up. All right. This is where you would disclose 2 things. One, that the buyer or seller is a licensed real estate, has a real estate license in South Carolina. And then this is also another place that the buyer and the seller have received the South Carolina Disclosure of Relationships form. If you're working with a FSBO, this is where they would sign it. However, if they're a transaction broker situation, they would only mark as customer service in this, not client. This is another area you are covered to acknowledge that they have seen the disclosure of brokerage relationships in South Carolina. Now, it's still required as a separate document as far as our compliance is concerned. That is on the table, however, to possibly take off because it is covered now in this agreement. The reason that it hasn't completely come off is because we still do have a couple other agreements that do not have the land, and the condo agreement do not have this in it yet. So until those get updated, we'll probably still leave it in there. Purchase price, section 2, pretty easy. This is where they put what the purchase price of the property is going to be. And then that's either going to be through 100% financing, 100% cash, or a combination of financing and cash, which is what 90% of your deals are going to be. If you are going with a cash deal, make sure that at this point, verification of cash for closing is either attached or not attached, or to be delivered before a certain date. If you're a buyer's agent, this isn't as important to you because honestly, the less is more. You could go with that mentality. The less you have to provide from the buyer side, the better that is. However, if you are a listing agent and you get a contract that's a cash offer, I'm going to want some sort of verification of cash. And if it's not going to be attached, if it says not attached, I'm going to strike that, or I'm going to recommend to my seller that we strike that and put a deadline in there to have some sort of verification of cash. One of my least favorite parts of the contract is this itty bitty little sentence right here with no bold and nothing really obvious in it, which is stating whether or not the contract is contingent or not contingent on another home selling. And then whether or not the form for this contingency, form 504, which is probably something we'll talk about soon, is attached to this. Now, again, same rule applies. If I'm a buyer's agent, I'm representing a buyer. I put an offer on a property that's contingent on my home selling. All I need to say is contingent on my home selling. That really basically gives me between now and closing with no stipulations to get my home sold, and as well as get financing and everything else. Now, that doesn't mean as a buyer's agent, you shouldn't recommend that you use Form 504 because conflict only arises when there's a difference in expectations. And if you have Form 504 filled out, then there's a clear expectations from everyone of what that looks like. Depending on what time we get done today, I might jump back to 504, but basically what this form says is if this contract is contingent, then this form that's attached will give the information that's needed, i.e., has the home been listed? Where's the home located? Who's listed it? Is it under contract? When are you allowing it? How much time are you allowing it to sell, etc. As a listing agent, I would never recommend that a seller I would seldom recommend that a seller accept an offer that is contingent on a home sale that does not have Form 504. Now, I don't know why a buyer wouldn't supply that. However, if you do get to that situation, and it is getting a little tricky, obviously that would be the time to pick up the phone and we would discuss why. All right, so we've flown through the first part here for a second. Take a deep breath. Any questions so far? It's hard to read the faces of the 95% of the people who aren't showing their faces. Jay, I just want to see your pretty face, man. I mean, you got the background, the killer beard. All right, we'll jump back in. So let's go to the fun part of the paragraph, which is talking about the property that is being sold. This is one that's causing a lot of fun, we'll just put it that way, for us over the days. This is the description of the property that's being sold, okay? A couple things that are important to talk about this. Any and all lot or parcel of land, appurtenant interests, improvements, landscapes, systems, and fixtures, and further, or anything else further described below in property. So right now we're already talking about things that are included. 90% of the questions you have can be answered by going to the contract. So landscape, yes, that would be included. Systems could not be more vague of a statement if they tried. However, that would include systems that would be included. Your landscape. Here we go. Water system, sprinkler system, lighting system, things that you would have that would be exterior to the home, I would say based on this is included. Now, let me just say something really quickly. If you've not been to a contracts class, when I turn the thing off and go back to the camera, it's because it's a serious point to be made. If there's ever a question, ask. So if you're making an offer and the buyer says, well, I really love the landscape lighting, is this included? You know what? Because that's a certain thing for you that you're really, really interested in, I'm going to make sure I say it's included by this paragraph right here. However, I'm going to confirm with the listing agent and put it in the contract just in case. Okay. So whenever in doubt, ask more questions and put it in the contract to make sure you're covered. So jump back to this. Very important sentence right here. Seller agrees to maintain the property in operable condition and any personal property conveying in the same operable condition, including any landscaping, grounds, and any agreed upon repairs or replacements from the effective date through closing, subject to normal wear and tear. So what this paragraph is saying, or this sentence in the paragraph is saying, by the way, this is also a good way to consult with your clients in your listing consultation, is Mr. and Mrs. Seller, great, we have a contract. Make sure you understand what this contract states is you have to maintain the property from here forward, just as if you were living in it. This also means that you have to maintain the personal property that's conveying. So let's say they throw a refrigerator in there down on the this blank down here, they have to maintain the operation of that refrigerator. The refrigerator is working when they go under contract and it breaks prior to the inspection. You can't say, well, that's not covered in repair procedure. If it's in here, they have to maintain it between now and closing. So just very important to remind them of that. The next part, which I would imagine, and I'm on the forms committee this year with SCR, I'd imagine this is going to come up. HOA, as it's written in the contract, it's currently stating, sorry for all the moving around, it's currently stating that the buyer has acknowledged the opportunity to inquire about owners association issues, common area issues, condominium master deed issues, assigned parking storage areas, membership, blah, 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 prior to signing the contract. Now, here's why this is super important. HOA issues rules that you don't like, funding, the financing, anything about the HOA you don't like is not covered in the repair procedure. So if you are buying a condo or a neighborhood with a strict association, Mount Pleasant, and you go under contract, and then the buyer gets a hold of the association and reads it and says, I don't like these rules. Technically, this sentence said they should have read those association documents prior to going under contract. So it's important to know that and just be cautious of it. Particularly, it's not so bad in say, single family detached neighborhoods, but if you start to go into condo associations, areas like that where you have issues that may arise, financial issues, those sorts of things, they would want to know about this ahead of time. Last part, leasing issues and items, finance equipment, tenants, leases, future vacation rentals, rents, deposit, all of these, that also will be included in what they purchase. Okay, so if you're purchasing the property, you're purchasing leases that they have in place. Those don't just get canceled. We get this all the time, by the way. Buyer comes in and purchases a, sorry, my screen just did a little crazy. Comes in and purchases an investment property, and that investment property has got a tenant in there, and all of a sudden they think the tenant's just going to move out at closing. That's not the case. They have tenants' rights to stay in the property up at that point, up until that point. Make sense? All right. Let's see where all of my all of my Zoom directions have disappeared. There we are. All right, so the question that came up, Daniel asked, says, when you add to the contract, do you insert text into the form or do you attach a separate page? Never add to the contract unless you've talked to an attorney. However, the one area would be in this area. If you are putting into the property that's being described below, then you would just put it in this area here. If it was going to be furniture, those sorts of things, you would have that put in here. Yes, you would write it in there, or you would do in an attachment and you could put a list of it on the addendum. Another question was HOA follow-up question. If buyer selects due diligence, can they get out of the contract if they discover things that they do not like, the HOA or POA? And yes, due diligence, they can get out for any reason whatsoever before due diligence is up. And we'll come to all that. All right, so next part of section 3 would be the actual property address. Property address here obviously is pretty self-explanatory. You fill in the blank. You would want to have all the information that's in here as possible. Tax map number is going to be super important, as well as the address. Make sure they match. One thing to keep in mind, listing agents, when you receive an offer on your property, you want to check that the tax map number they put in here matches yours. Reason this is important, we just recently had a listing of a condo, and the buyer's agent put in an offer for a condo and a garage, and they included both the condo and the garage in here. However, what they did not know is that the buyer had sold the garage about a month ago. The listing agent did not catch, neither did the seller, catch that there were 2 TMS numbers in here, one including the garage and one including the condo. So we moved forward, and about a week into it for inspections, the buyer's agent asked for access to the garage. Listing agent says there is no garage included. Now, all of a sudden, we've got a conflict. Now, clearly, the seller can't sell a garage he doesn't own anymore. Now we have the issue of a buyer who was purchasing what they thought was a condo and a garage for a certain price. A seller saying we never advertised the garage, so I shouldn't get it. However, they're under contract now for something they don't own. And now the lawyers have to look at it to see who can get out. Okay. Now, in my opinion, and I've told our agent as well as the buyer's agent, that was both of their faults. There should have been some more clarity in discussion ahead of time. The buyer's agent should have been more clear. There was no garage offered in the MLS or anything like that. They should have probably communicated it more clearly. And then on our side, the listing agent absolutely should have caught, because not only did they have the TMS number, they did have garage written in there. Again, mistakes happen. Totally get it. No judgment. And we've got to find a way to get through them. If you don't have information, if you can't find all the information you need in the tax records to fill in here, at least put dashes in there just so they're not blank. I know that sounds silly, but I hate blanks in contracts. So even if you just have a dash through there, I wouldn't put NA just because it could be misrepresented. Just a dash is fine. All right. Conveyance, closing, possession. Basically, closing occurs at 5 p.m. on or before whatever date is here, which is now considered the closing date. Conveyance shall be fee simple, made subject to all easements, reservations, rights of way, restriction, covenants of record, provided they not make the title unmarketable. So basically, they have to have a marketable title. And to all government statutes, ordinance, rules, permits, and regulations. Seller agrees to convey marketable title with a properly recorded general warranty deed, free of encumbrances and liens, except as herein stated, and in names blank. So this is where they would put the names of what they want the title in there. Quite honestly, I don't know why this is still in there. But if your buyers have what they want to put in there, that's fine. If you don't have anything in there, it does not affect the contract. A couple things I want to point out specifically in this one. First of all, the property belongs to the seller until 5 p.m. on that day. And the reason that I talk about this is a lot of times something happens on the day of closing and people start freaking out. Closing was scheduled for 9 a.m. and let's just say the seller didn't do everything they needed to do by 9 a.m. Take all the other deadlines out of this. People freak out and say, well, they're in breach of closing contract because they didn't close and we're closing at 9. No, it says 5 p.m. So just because the buyer chose 9 doesn't mean that the seller is absolutely obligated to have everything done by 9. Now, this is a technicality on which you don't want to battle, right? I mean, if you have a closing scheduled at 9, then schedule the closing at 9. Schedule everything to be done the day before. But understand that they have until 5 p.m. on that day to get everything done. Also super important to understand that if the buyers are not able to close on the loan and fund it by 5 p.m. that day, this contract is dead. So if you're trying to clean anything up and you don't have anything worked out and then something happens in the final hour and you don't get an extension as the listing agent, you don't have a contract after 5 p.m. Now, that's not always a terrible thing because you may have a buyer that's now desperate to get back into the contract, but we're not looking for desperate buyers. We're looking to close on a contract that everyone agreed upon. If you are a buyer's agent and your lender at the last minute tells you, we are not going to get funding today, but we will have it Monday. Okay, great is not a way to handle that. You need an extension. The seller has to agree to extend it to Monday and they do not have to. Right? So I know that sounded weird. They have to agree to extend it to Monday in order for the buyers to close. They are not obligated per the contract to extend it to Monday for the buyers to close. This is super important right now. And where it sounds like it's kind of obvious, the reason this is so important is people just are blaming it on lenders. That doesn't matter. Nothing in here says except if the lender doesn't perform. It's based on the buyer and the seller. Those are the only parties of the contract. So you need to be, as a buyer's agent, diligently following up with the lender that week. And if 1 or 2 days beforehand you start to get, or 3 days beforehand you start to get, they're getting a little shifty, then you need to get on the horn with your buyer. By the way, you're not the knight in shining armor in every situation. If you've got a situation where you have a lender that's not getting you some answers, there's nothing wrong with calling your buyer and saying, hey, I need your help holding these people to the fire, because if we don't close at Friday at 5, you do not have a contract. The sellers do not have to extend it. And I'd love to say that sounds dramatic. You would be shocked at what I've seen over the last 6 months. We've had sellers that waited till 5:01. We were subpoenaed for a deposition last week. Sellers waited till 5:01. The lending hadn't been funded. They sent over a termination and cancellation of the contract. And now they turned around and sold it to someone else. These buyers had everything in their moving truck ready to move in. The only thing they needed was the funding of this. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just telling you our job is to protect them in the contract. So it's super important that everyone understands this 5 p.m. is not a suggestion. And for us old schoolers, we don't have the whatever days they used to be called where we had a couple days of grace. All right, let me go into these couple questions really quickly. Yeah, so Lauren asked about getting the HOA information ahead of time from the agent. A lot of times you can go directly to, most HOAs will have it on their website. So if you're looking at a bunch of homes in a certain organization, you can get, now most of that is going to be the public record policies and guidelines. The challenge is if they wanted to dig any further, they probably have to formally request on that. And then I see that Deb came in and answered it, and Lauren said, great idea. So I'm glad I could be here to help for you guys to go through that whole conversation. All right, so earnest money. Section 5, earnest money, everyone's favorite. So now we got earnest money. Earnest money is not required for the contract. Earnest money can be zero. I'm not recommending that it should be. However, a lot of times if someone, offers something tiny or zero, people say, well, it's not a valid contract. That's not true. Earnest money is not consideration. Earnest money is a promise to perform. Okay. So earnest money is divided into 3 different ways. Number 1 is in the first line, which gives you the total earnest money that is due. Okay. I'm going to give you $1,000 earnest money, and it's going to be paid as followed. A certain amount will be accompanied with the offer, and then a certain amount will be paid by 6 p.m. on a later date. Okay. If you are representing a buyer and they do not have the earnest money to literally turn in as they're submitting the offer, then it does not accompany the offer. So at that point, you would just simply use the second option, which it will be turned in by 6 p.m. on a later date. Okay. If you are a listing agent, that 6 p.m. on a later date, in my opinion, does not need to be any further out than the next business day. Right? If they're purchasing a home, they should be ready to submit their earnest money within the next business day, by the end of the day. Here are a couple different reasons why. One, it does say later, last sentence right here, if the earnest money is not delivered, the seller may terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination, unilateral. Buyer doesn't turn it in, 601, all they have to do, fire off an email that says, with the notice of termination, says, we're out. You didn't turn in the earnest money, you can't argue with them. So that's the reason that you want to do it on the buyer side. On the seller side, the reason you don't want to do it. We've had this happen. Everybody's hot to trot. They get everything going. Earnest money's not turned in for a couple days. Inspector says, I can actually get out there tomorrow to do the inspection. Great. They go out there. Inspection turns up something that's outside of repair procedure, but the buyer doesn't like it. And they say, I'm out. And I didn't turn my earnest money, so I'm just going to move on. Well, now you got a buyer that's in default because he's leaving a contract outside of the repair procedure. They've not turned in their earnest money, so what do they care? And you've got a seller that's looking at you saying, hey, listing agent, where's my earnest money? How come nobody verified it was turned in? So you got to be very, very careful if you have this second option checked, that you know why it's going to take more than a day. And is it necessary to do that if they have repair procedure? If it's due diligence, it's a different story, but just keep in mind that it can get tricky if you're waiting out a couple days for the earnest money. Now, the thing to keep in mind too, this real bulky paragraph here basically says escrow agent will not disperse, this is very important, will not disperse earnest money deposit to either party until both parties have executed an agreement authorizing the disbursement, or until a court of competent jurisdiction has directed a disbursement. It's important to explain that, because even in a situation where it's completely obvious that one of them defaulted, the escrow agent, the person named up here, and by the way, that's not you, the person named up here cannot release the money without one of these 3 things, okay? Or one of these 2 things. If illegal action occurs related to earnest money, parties receiving the least amount of earnest money in the court's disbursement order agrees to indemnify escrow agent's fees, court costs, and attorney's fees. If interpleader is to be utilized, parties agree that blank shall be paid to the escrow agent. So what this is saying is if they go into they battle, the person who had to pay the less, or the person who got the less out of it, then has to reimburse. Okay, so it's not just as simple as you just go to court and you fight it out. This is something we have to take into consideration, and we're seeing a lot more of it right now. I will tell you that probably out of all the earnest money disputes so far this year, which have been, or the last 12 months, I should say, which have been plentiful, we've only had 2, 3 now that have gone to some sort of mediation, court, that sort of thing, which is good. However, it just means a lot of communication between me and the other brokers, which is fine. I'd actually prefer that. 9 times out of 10, we can get something worked out. But just understand that it's not, at the end of the day, it's not something that can just be decided by the agents and the escrow agent. All right, how's everybody doing so far? It's exciting stuff, isn't it? This is why you're here, man. You gotta represent your clients. You gotta know what's going on. Now, you're not an attorney. You don't have to interpret it, but you have to be able to explain. All right, section 6. Let's jump back in. Transaction clause. This is the part where it discloses what the typical transaction costs are. I'm not going to go into the details of all of them. I'm really going to talk about where we get involved as it relates to negotiation. This talks about what the typical transaction costs are for both the buyers and the sellers in the contract. We then go into this part here where it says all costs obtained costs to obtain information from a pertaining to form. Let me start this one over actually and actually read it to you in English. All costs to obtain information from or pertaining to owners associations, private public transfer fees, or any costs similar to transfer fees, which would be certificates of assessment, capital contributions, any of those. This is where you negotiate this out. Okay. So what that means is in the event that anybody has to pay, if you have to pay for a certificate of assessment, which is basically a fee that the HOA charges, if there's a capital contribution fee, is there any sort of fee that has to be contributed to the HOA, you have to have one of these selected. If they are not selected, they will automatically be added to the seller side. Here's why this is important. A lot of times, and this should be part of your listing consultation, we dealt with this and it cost us about $1,200. A lot of people lived in neighborhoods who've never had contribution fees, right? Which basically means welcome to the neighborhood. You're going to pay us 1/2 of 1% to join. And when we went through the listing presentation, or we went through the negotiation, I explained this to them and they said, well, they've marked that it's our cost. That doesn't really matter. We don't have a contribution fee. Sign the contract, move forward. Little did they know in the HOA meeting the week prior, they had voted in a capital contribution fee. Fast forward to closing, there's an additional $1,200 charge to the seller on there. Seller was like, we should have known about this. It caused a conflict. So it's super important that as part of your listing consultation, you make sure the seller confirms there are no fees for which they have to contribute. This is also, jumping back into it, this is also where the seller will agree to contribute to the seller's closing costs, the buyer's closing costs. Seller will pay buyer's transaction costs not to exceed blank amount, which is a dollar figure. It is no longer a percentage. I have been asked as if we can change this to a percentage to fill in the blank versus a dollar amount. It's yes, and make sure you communicate it at a very high level. The reason people want to do that, you offer $200,000, you ask for $6,000 in closing costs, but then they come back and say they want, they're only going to pay $175,000. Then you've got to adjust the closing costs. A percentage just helps all of that there. All right, jump to financing and let me look in questions really quickly. Holding the money, the seller can then control by not signing the escrow agreement. Okay, so the question comes in and says, if the escrow agent requires that both parties agree to them holding the money, the seller can then control by not signing the escrow agreement, even if the buyer is ready to send it over. I'm not sure, Murray, let's talk about that one offline. I don't know that I understand that question. All right, financing, paragraph 7. Paragraph 7 is where the buyer is going to say what type of financing they have and whether or not the contract is contingent upon the financing. They can have a 30, 15 or other loan, maximum amount of X percent. Don't leave any of these blank. You want to protect your buyers. Big important parts of this from both the buyer side and the seller side. Buyer shall apply, right? Shall is basically the same thing as must. The buyer will apply for financing by blank date. There's no reason that this should be more than 1 business day after the ratification. If they're not ready to apply for financing in this market, they're not ready to put in an offer. So if you get a date that's a couple days out, I'd automatically red flag that. And then they deliver notice to seller of reasonable pre-final loan approval, meaning a pre-approval letter, initial approval letter that contains no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by blank. Okay. Also, no repairs required prior to this notice. Final loan approval occurs when the lender funds the loan. All right, so let's talk about this. This was kind of snuck in last year that a lot of people don't really realize. What this second date is telling us, where we have this pre-approval, pre-final loan approval, is basically giving more time to do what most people were expecting to be done prior to offer, which is to have a pre-approval letter, not pre-qualified letter, right? All this date tells you is that the lender has looked at all of the conditions And they have said, based on the information you've given me and sent in, that we're good to go with no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions by this date. This is not a final approval. Final approval is very clearly written right here. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan. So what happens is a lot of people see this date go by and they think they're great, and then they get to a week before closing, they can't get lending because of whatever reason. Now, if they went out and bought a car or they intentionally did something that messed it up, that's a different story. But if something came up that didn't come up before for whatever reason, and the lending's not approved at that point, your seller is probably going to have to walk on this and may not be entitled to the earnest money or damages. So it's very important to stay on these buyer's agents and the lenders to make sure that they are in the process to move forward and have everything done by closing. Next part, if buyer changes their lender during the financing period, which technically is before this second date, they must notify the seller in writing within blank calendar days. I would put 3, no more than, to give them the weekend. So they have to notify the seller as soon as they change a lender. They're required to do so. Here's an important part. Absent written approval by the seller, the buyer cannot change their lender if by doing so, it changes the closing date in paragraph 4. Okay, so if they're going to go loan shopping and they tell you that as their agent, you need to say to them as a buyer's agent, hey, if you change your lender and it changes the closing date, the seller does not have to agree to move the closing date. So you can change your lender all day long, but if they can't reach the closing date we've already agreed on, then they don't have to extend the contract. We could possibly be in breach. You could be at risk of losing the earnest money, as well as damages, attorney's costs, and those sorts of things. Well, what are those, Mr. Buyer's Agent? You're going to have to talk to an attorney. Okay. All right. We're about to jump into the big part. How's everybody doing?
Great.
What'd you say, Kayla?
Great. I'm doing great.
Awesome. Thank you. The participation is stunning.
I have a question,
Mm-hmm.
Joseph. What date in the financing contingency do they get their earnest money back by?
Depends on the situation.
Okay.
So if they get denied financing from their approval, as long as they got denied financing before that pre-qual date, they would be fine. But if they've been given a pre-approval, basically saying we'll move forward, and there's no unreasonable conditions or anything like that, and then it falls through because some lending guidelines change, or there's a handful of different ways, then they could argue at that point they get their earnest money back.
Okay.
So what kind of date do you put in there? I've seen an offer come through recently for Karen that it's a week from actual closing date. Isn't that too far?
Yeah, I think I think that is too far. And what I will tell you is probably happening most times, and this is a great question, Deb, because most times what's happening there is it's a misunderstanding by the buyer's agent of what that date means. It's not, most of the time agents aren't trying to do something tricky, right? So I think a simple communication would be, hey, I noticed that you put February 15th. The challenge we have on that is that basically means they don't really have to they can apply, great, but then they can drag their feet at giving all of their information to them until the week before, and that puts us at risk. So we'd prefer to have this pre-qual prior to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. What else? All right, here we go. Buckle up, folks. It's section 8, our favorite section, repairs. All right, in South Carolina, when you purchase a home using Form 310, you have 3 options as a buyer and as a seller as it relates to how to have the home inspected and or have any repairs requested. They are the repair procedure, which we'll go over first. There's then due diligence, and then as is. Let's go through repair procedure. In a nutshell, the best way to look at repair procedure is pre-agreed repairs, right? What the repair procedure says is that all repair procedure inspections and requests shall be completed and delivered by 6 p.m. on blank date. This can be, 2 weeks is, in my opinion, is fine, because understand they have to have the inspection done and they have to request repairs. you can maybe get away with 10 days depending on when it is. As a buyer's agent, I do think one of the things to do is if you're negotiating this and you know this is the house you're going to go in on, you might want to go ahead and pick up the phone to your inspector and say, hey, how quickly can we get you into 123 Main? You can always postpone an inspection, right? But go ahead and get on their calendar. So up until that point, you get the property inspected by any and all inspectors you need to get. We're going to come back to that, but just any and all inspectors you need to get. Now, actually, I'm going to go to it now. That's the reason you should get it done sooner rather than later, because a lot of times home inspectors are going to come back and say, recommend a licensed electrician check this, or recommend a licensed HVAC person check this. Let me just go ahead and say this, and I mean this with all love. Requesting a seller to have an inspection is not part of the contract. So when you submit a repair procedure that says request seller have a licensed HVAC inspector inspect the HVAC, you've now changing the contract to make the seller do the inspection versus you doing the inspection, or a licensed electrician, right? Now, keep in mind, it doesn't mean they can't do it. Sure, they can, but why would you want the seller to do it? The seller's now going to go find their inspector to come out and do an inspection that's going to be working for them. Okay, so all those inspections would be covered during this first time period here. Now, in the event the inspector finds anything that needs to be repaired that falls under these main areas here, which are going to be heating system, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, water waste systems, anything that's within that needs to be done to convey them in operating condition, or to make the roof free of leaks, address any environmental concerns, and to make improvements structurally sound. Any of those come up, then you put notice to say these need to happen. These repairs, these things need to happen in order for you to be within the contract here. Right? It specifically says it right here. If the buyer fails to notify the seller within this time frame, buyer shall have waived the rights under this section. That's not good. Okay. If the lender's commitment requires any additional inspections or certification, these are to be provided by the buyer. It does not state these are necessarily protected by this deadline. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility to inspect the structure, square footage, environmental concerns, including but not limited to, and then it lists basically everything again, and then adds mold, radon gas, lead-based hazards, everything of those, appurtenant buildings, heating systems, air conditioning, electrical systems. What this is telling us is twofold. It is saying, buyer, we will, per the contract, if any of these issues come up and you have it inspected and you show it that these issues have come up, we agree that we will fix them, or you can get out of the contract. You also have the obligation to have all of that inspected, right? It's not my job to inspect it, which is kind of what I was saying before. Now, in the event that something else comes up, well, we'll get to that. In the event that the seller does not want to do these repairs, then the buyer can get out. However, if the seller does agree to do the repairs, the buyer must stay in the contract as the seller of the repairs that are covered in the contract. So then we move to the second paragraph of the repair procedure that says no later than 6 p.m. on blank date, seller shall deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs in the buyer's repair requests. Now, here's the thing. This is where it gets a little tricky. First of all, this date should be at least, I would say, 3 business days after this date up here, because you need to give your sellers time to do the research of what the cost is going to be on some of these. Now, if they, if they have 10 days in there for this first date and they get it done in 2 days, it's kind of a moot point. Go ahead and submit it over and everything gets done quickly. However, it says right here, seller shall deliver notice of agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs in the buyer's repair request. Now, the buyer's repair request can include all repairs, anything. It could have repairs that aren't part of the paragraph. That's where this gets said. The cost of all repairs to heating, air conditioning, electrical systems, wastewater systems, making them operable, free of leaks. I love having glass doors and walls, by the way. Everybody say hi to John Crompton. Contracts. He doesn't need to be in here because he's a contract expert.
I got him on speed dial.
That's right. Which is also fine. So the cost of all repairs, heating, air conditioning, electrical systems are the responsibility of the seller. So it's basically saying, listen, if we're going to agree to these, we only have to take on the costs of the repairs that are those. Now, as this is written, I would say, sure, you can just say, I'll agree to that repair addendum, but this states I only have to pay for what's covered in there. I wouldn't handle it that way. I would strike what they do not plan to cover in the repair addendum. Okay. Seller paid requests do not include the following item: home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance. Now, landscaping, understand, that doesn't mean they don't need to maintain the landscaping, right? But they don't have to repair it if anything's wrong with it. Preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, energy efficiency. The seller contractually agrees to make all requested seller repairs. Two parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. The repairs to any other items are sole responsibility of the buyer. All right. So, anybody's eyes crossed yet on this one? Basically, begin an inspection. If any of these things come up, the seller has an obligation to repair them to stay in the contract. However, if they do not, they can be released from the contract, as can the buyer. If they agree to do anything that is covered under paragraph 8 that comes up in the notice given to them, then all parties must move forward with the contract. Then, let's say we get into some debate. The debate then gets solved, kind of, in the third paragraph of the repair section, which is, if seller does not timely respond or does not agree to make all seller paid repairs, the buyer shall within 2 calendar days. Now, the argument here is whether or not it's 2 calendar days from this date or 2 calendar days of when the repairs were submitted. I say it's this date on here. Doesn't matter. Get back to them as soon as possible. Then the buyer can either accept the property as is. They can negotiate and amend the contract, which obviously you're trying to do. So obviously that's not going to be done if they haven't gotten back to you. Or the buyer can terminate the contract by delivered notice. If the buyer fails to do any of those within the 2 calendar days, the buyer agrees to buy and the seller agrees to sell as is, which means nothing's being done. All right. Now I see we had a question in here. Let me pull it up really quickly. See where that went. There we go. All right. So in repair procedure, does the seller agree to make repairs required by the buyer's lender or not? So that's a tricky one because it definitely says in here if the lenders requires it under repair procedure, says the buyer needs to deliver that to them. That really only comes in with FHA and VA. And if they had checked that off earlier by saying they're accepting that, then yes, they would agree that they would have to make the repairs in there. That being said, it's treated the same way as the repairs here. If they do not make the repairs, they don't get penalized. Everybody gets released from the contract. All right. Part 2, due diligence, the easiest one. Due diligence basically says you have a due diligence period from the effective date until a date done here. All this next part says is during that time, you get any and all inspections that you want. You request any repairs that you want. You do any research that you want. You negotiate anything you can. When you deliver the repair request, it's asking the seller to repair anything and everything you want them to do. And they can say no to all of those. And then once that's done, you're allowed to proceed under the amended contract by saying, hey, we've agreed to these repairs. You could proceed under the as-is contract, or you can terminate the contract by 6 p.m. on this date. Okay, this is very, very black and white. And the reason I say that is you can be talking about it all day long with the buyer and seller, but it does not extend the deadline. You can be talking about it all week. When 6 p.m. comes around, if you've not amended the contract, you've moved, or you've not terminated the contract by 6 p.m., you've moved forward as is. We have one right now. We represent the seller. Back and forth, back and forth. Finally, in the email, our agent told the buyer's agent, hey, here's what the agent or our seller's agreeing to do. If you want to get that to us, get that to us, but he's not doing anything else. They did not get back to us by 6 p.m. on there. They got back to us at like 10:30, 11 o'clock that night. And now they're all upset because they said, hey, you guys said this in the email. It doesn't matter, right? You either needed to terminate, come up with a new amended contract, which means it's on one of these forms and has been agreed upon, or you're proceeding as is. There is the opportunity to put in a termination fee in here. The question I always get for this is, what should that amount be? Some people say equivalent to the earnest money. I personally feel like that's a little punitive if the earnest money is super high. What you can do if you have a 2-week due diligence, maybe get a rough estimate of what 2 weeks worth of a mortgage would be in that price point, or carrying costs, or that sort of thing. Question is, what's recommended due diligence? Because you have to have all of this done. I would say 2 weeks to give that 7 to 10 business days. I think in this market is reasonable, because you've got an issue with inspectors getting out there in a certain period of time. Then you got to understand that once the inspector goes, you got to get the report. Your buyer's got to review it. Then you got to decide what you really care about. Then you got to send it to the seller. The seller's then got to get a contractor to say, hey, here's what I want to do. What all does this cost? So I would give 2 weeks on it. I know a lot of listing agents are like, no, you should do it as quickly as possible. That's fine. You can try to do that. We're not, again, my number one golden rule of contracts is the purpose of a contract is not written to win the earnest money. The purpose of the contract is for the buyer and seller to come to an agreement and close on a house. So all we do by shortening up periods and doing stuff like that is try to really cause people to default, which I don't really think is a win-win. All right. Now, it specifically states again in all bold, in the event you don't do anything by the end of due diligence, everybody moves forward as is, which means they're buying the house regardless of what comes up. Now, one could argue, what happens if financing falls through? All right, well, then possibly they'd get out of that. But if something comes up, if they can still get financing and they can still purchase the home, they got to purchase the home. And then as is the most cut and dry one. And quite honestly, I haven't yet. I'm close to possibly maybe consulting with some people about making this not a recommended practice within Keller Williams, because it is not good. It basically in no way, shape, or form protects your buyer. And where it's good for the seller, possibly, I think it's still open enough. And the SCR attorney agrees on this, is it opens it up for a lot of conflict. Because if you have an as-is contract, but you've still got financing contingency, well, the seller may think, hey, as is, or you've got as-is contract, yet you've still got paragraph 11 with the CL 100. Now you've got a conflict. So there's just, the bottom line is, as is means you can buy the house, you can get it inspected, you can have any and everybody inspect it. There's a deadline on the inspections. I don't even know why there's a deadline on the inspections, because it doesn't matter. But it says the seller is under no obligation to remedy any issues the buyer discovers during their inspections. And the buyer may not terminate the contract based on the results of any inspections conducted. I get that a lot of people think that makes you very competitive. It does, I'm sure. However, here's what I know. At the end of the day, as black and white as the contract is, if a buyer doesn't want to buy and a seller doesn't want to, or a seller doesn't want to sell, great. They've got a contract that doesn't work in their favor. That doesn't mean they're going to just say, oh, okay, right? So that's why I go back to communicate what the purpose is. Mr. Buyer, you want to go in as is. What does that mean? Because here's what happens most of the time. Sellers say they want to sell the home as is. And what that means is they're not going to do repairs, right? Which a buyer could be completely open to. Then that's a different verbiage than as is now. If you go in to say as is now, a buyer may be thinking, sure, I won't ask for any repairs. Then they go get it inspected and the foundation's settling. Doesn't matter if they've checked off as is. They could say, well, I was open to not doing repairs, but this is a bad repair. I mean, this is more than I want to take on. They're not protected in that. So it's really hard to justify from a buyer standpoint doing this, unless it's just an extenuating circumstance. Okay. All right. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing good. Let's jump back onto it. All right, inspection rights, inspection rights. Buyer and sellers licensed and insured inspectors reasonably perform any reasonable, ultimately non-destructive examination and make reasonable record of the property with reasonable notice to seller through closing. Okay, basically it's saying you can have the home inspected, give us notice. You can't go destroy the home, tear it apart looking for it. It's got to be reasonable on how you're doing it. And then they are saying in here that they do need to be licensed inspectors. That would be mainly towards the repair procedure. Due diligence, it's really kind of hard to just, to say it has to be done by a licensed inspector, because due diligence, sure, you can have inspectors done, but then you could also have someone come in with an opinion that's not an inspector, and that's going to be protected. The bold here says the seller will make property accessible for inspections and not unreasonably withhold access unless otherwise agreed on in writing. Seller will grant the buyer the right to perform the final walkthrough of inspection to the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. Seller will keep on the utilities operational through closing unless otherwise agreed. And then you would check here, seller grants buyer permission to connect utilities, pay for utilities, yada, yada, yada here. I don't ever recommend that you allow the other party to take on the utilities, yourself included. That may come up a couple times if you do any REO bank-owned properties. You may have to put utilities on in your name, but where the buyer may have to for inspections. In any other situation, though, I would not recommend that. This does give a short reminder that just came up recently in one of our transactions, just to make a little side note for you buyer's agents. Be sure to remind your buyers that they have to turn electricity on the day of closing. The sellers turn electricity off on the day of typically. The buyer should have it turned on the day of typically as well. Just quick reminder on that one. Appraised value. Paragraph 10, the contract can either be contingent on or not on the appraisal. Now, basically, that's pretty self-explanatory what these are. If it is contingent on the appraisal, here's how that works. If the appraisal comes in low and the seller agrees to move to the appraised value and accept that and all other terms, including the same closing costs, everything else, if the seller agrees to do that, then the buyer has to go forward with the closing. However, the seller does not have to agree to do that. And if not, everybody can walk from the contract without penalty. Here's where you want to caution yourself. A lot of people now are putting this contract is not contingent upon the property being valued because they're getting into bidding wars and we're in a crazy market and everyone's losing their mind. Here's the challenge you're going to have on that is you can say the contract's not contingent on the appraisal all day long. The lender may not agree with you. And the lender may say, I don't care if the contract wasn't contingent on there. If your assumption, because here's what happens, the seller's assumption is if it's not contingent on appraiser, then the buyer will just come up with the difference in cash. Not all loans will allow that to happen because they now have a loan to value ratio that's different than the initial approval. So you just want to be very, very careful if you have someone coming in and they're getting financing and it's 80+% financing. It's not as simple as just saying it's not contingent on the appraisal and the buyer will just pay more for it. That may not work. The buyer actually could still get out of the contract because the financing did not go through. Okay. Wood infestation report basically works the same as the repair procedure. Wood infestation report states that it either is or is not contingent upon the buyer or the seller having the property inspected at their own expense by someone selected by the buyer or seller. And then the buyer or seller shall deliver timely notice of the CO 100 report no earlier than 30 days prior to closing and no later than blank days prior to closing. In the event anything comes up in this report that needs to be addressed to clear it, the seller has agreed that they will do in order to move forward with the contract. However, if they do not do it, the buyer is not required to move forward and they are not penalized. Couple things on this. One, I think if you're representing the buyer, it should be your recommendation that the buyer pick the person, the buyer pay for the person, and the buyer deliver notice because the buyer it's no different than an inspection. I know a lot of times buyer's agents want the seller to pay for it to save their buyer a couple bucks. It's less than $100. They should be hiring someone on here. If you do not deliver it by the no later than calendar days, you run the risk. I'm not going to state this. I'm not an attorney. You run the risk as the buyer of voiding this and the seller saying, you didn't deliver it to me in time. I don't have to do anything. Again, this may work depending on the financing. This may work against you when it comes to financing. So again, it's all about making sure all the numbers and everything come together. Basically, this next paragraph that's on here talks about what I said. It's the three options that you have. The seller shall remedy any deficiencies, have all this done. In the event they don't do that, the buyer can either accept the property in its present condition, negotiate with the seller for payment of these repairs, or terminate the contract by delivering notice to the seller. All right, let me look. I got a question here for this. So Lauren's question is a follow-up question regarding the inspections and the lender. This is a great question. So for example, it's an FHA VA loan. You won't know what the lender's required repairs are until the appraisal. No way that's done prior to repair procedure deadline ending. Correct. Can you still get the earnest money back for the buyer if seller refuses to make lender required repairs? This would likely also be for pre-approvals. Yes. So the answer to your question on that is yes. If you have, because a lender's inspection is basically their appraisal, right? Which is part of their contingency in financing. So this is why it's also important to kind of be aware and know how all that works should you get an offer that does to have that type of financing. So in Lauren's case, the question she has, an example that she has is, let's say you get through and you negotiate everything with repair procedures. Fast forward 2 weeks, the week before closing, week and a half before closing, lender sends out their appraiser, and the appraiser says, hey, you've got a deck that's 18 inches high off the ground, so you have to put a railing up, or some of their many challenging guidelines. We'll just put it that way. If the seller refuses to do it, then yes, the buyer can get out of the contract. And it is my opinion that they would receive their earnest money. However, if the listing agent has not done a good job explaining that to the seller and they're caught off guard, there may be a little bit of a fight. 9 times out of 10, it gets worked out though. All right, jump back into it. Good news is the rest of the contract is pretty much read it, and their disclosure issues, and people have been sued before because of this, so we have to put it in the contract. So we're just going to throw it in here as an extra thing. Paragraph 12, survey, title, examination, elevation, and insurance. This is basically a disclosure paragraph that says that we recommend that you have the property surveyed, title examined, which will happen, elevation, wetlands, beachfront determined, and appropriate insurance, flood contents, hazard, liability, effective at closing. Unless otherwise agreed upon in writing by parties, buyer to obtain new insurance policies by closing, and seller may cancel existing insurance after closing. Flood insurance, if required by lender or a buyer's option, shall be assigned to the buyer with permission of carrier and premium prorated to closing. Buyers are solely responsible to investigate pricing, availability, coverage, and requirements of insurance for the property prior to signing the contract. This is another one. If you have repair procedure and you do not know what your insurance is going to cost, and you get into it and the buyer finds out their insurance is going to cost them $6,000 a year and they had no idea they could do that and they can still get financing, they technically will not be protected if they want to get out of the contract, because this specifically states you did your homework ahead of time, which is all the more reason why due diligence is better for buyers. And I understand in this market, it doesn't make you as competitive. So do your homework ahead of time. Survival basically says anything agreed upon in the contract is required to be observed, kept in place after closing. Again, this is closing is your leverage. So if the seller's agreed to do repairs and they haven't done it, technically this protects it and says after closing they'll still do it. Then you've got to go have them do it. But so my thing is always have them do it by closing. However, this does technically state that it survives closing. Home warranty basically states that there will be a home warranty or will not be a home warranty, who's going to pay for it, what the company is going to be, and in all caps discloses that there is a chance that the agents are making money off of the home warranty, but you are not required to purchase a home warranty. If you are selling your personal property, by the way, to be covered on E&O, you have to, if you're purchasing it, you have to make sure that, or if you're selling it, you have to make sure the buyer side knows that a home warranty is available. Doesn't mean you have to provide one, but you want to make sure in negotiations or somewhere you do put them on notice that there is a home warranty is available for it. Paragraph 15 basically says if anything happens to the property, fire, hurricane, anything that it is, You can basically repair all the damage and sell it. You can remit to the buyer the amount for sufficient that for repairs, or assign to the buyer the right to all proceeds of insurance for that. If none of those work out, it can be canceled with no penalty to the buyer. Paragraph 16 says that the buyer has or seller has or has not filled out and delivered a seller's property disclosure. There really is only a couple reasons that the seller will not provide it. In accordance to the South Carolina Code of Law, we're probably going to do a broker minute about that, because there's been a lot of questions about what qualifies to not fill it out. And a lot of times we're mistaken on what that is. So you want to make sure if your buyer checks this off, it's basically stating, hey, I've seen the property disclosure statement, I've read the property disclosure statement, and I'm okay with the property disclosure statement. So I now have more people walking past my office. So just understand that this is what is going to happen here is it basically says they have filled it out and they're okay with it. All right. So if they check that off, make sure that they have actually read the property condition disclosure. 17, lead-based paint. Basically, if the home was built prior to 1978, you do have to have disclosure signed by everyone regarding lead-based paint. Sex offender criminal information, any of that information is the brokers are not responsible to provide that. So if the buyers or sellers are interested in that, they do need to go to public record. Trust account doesn't really pertain because I don't know of any escrow agents that have an interest-bearing trust account. But this is basically says that it's giving permission that the broker may or may not place deposit earnest money into an interest-bearing trust account. Most of the time, buyers don't care unless you're talking about a huge amount of money. And in that case, it doesn't really pertain because none of the escrow agents hold it. So you can put may not on here. It protects the buyer and they'll be fine. Paragraph 20 says they will cooperate with the non-resident gain and comply at closing. The the attorney will take out the proper taxes as calculated at closing. 21 basically says that they've signed here is the entire binding agreement between the parties, that there are no other agreements, oral or otherwise, modifying the terms. That includes, but is not limited to, a pre-occupancy agreement, a leaseback agreement, additional money outside of closing. No other agreements between the parties of the contract can be outside of this one. Excuse me 1 second. All right, adjustments. Basically, this is a disclosure that on the day of closing, the adjustments will be prorated when it comes to any sort of costs that you have. So if you have HOA fees, your taxes, any assessments that are been done, those will all be prorated to the day of closing. The day of closing belongs to the seller. And this just says that the attorney will do that. These are the standard bullet points. If a buyer or seller asks you what happens if they were to default on the contract, you can point them to paragraph 23 and then say, if you have any questions on specifically what these are, you will need to talk to an attorney. Because how it's written is pretty aggressive. However, what you want to get away from is, well, I mean, if I walk away, are they really going to sue me? If I give them the earnest money, are they really going to sue me to buy the house? Well, no, they're not. I mean, I can tell you right now, a long time of doing real estate, I've never heard of a situation where a buyer actually was sued and had to perform on purchasing a home. That's not the only penalty, though. That could cost them money. The exposure that the sellers had damages anything they had there. So if you get into those discussions, reach out to me or have them reach out to an attorney. Mediation basically says if there is a conflict here, that in order to avoid any sort of expensive litigation, yada, 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 that they will try to mediate the conflict first prior to suing everybody. And that we have policies and guidelines and recommended mediators that are, not of conflict that could help with us. This is actually a very productive way to go. We've done this a couple times this year. Non-reliance clause basically says that basically everybody in this has freely entered into this contract. They've read it, they understand it, and they had any questions outside the scope of real estate, i.e. law, taxes, finances, that they've consulted with outside parties regarding that. 26 kind of repeats this, which basically is saying that the brokers give no warranties as it's done as far as the condition of the property, the structure of the property, the property itself, schools, title, any of that, that's not based on the agent. They need to do their research on that. Broker's compensation, this basically is agreed that the broker's compensation has already been negotiated and will be paid by the closing attorney. 28 is where you'll add any attachments. So if you do add any addendums or you put anything into an addendum, you will need to reference this addendum. Here's a list of possible ones that will be in here. You want to reference them in this blank here. A lot of people try to write addendums in here. Again, do not write anything that an attorney has not given you. But you want to reference it and put it on an addendum right here. One thing that you do want to make sure that you let people know is if you do have an addendum, make sure you spell that out in your offer. If you're, for instance, we just had a situation where we submitted an offer and one of the agent, there was a competing offer situation and our agent submitted an offer with an escalation clause and the listing agent did not see the escalation clause. And so they accepted someone else's offer, which did not go well with our clients. And you know, one can argue all day long, well, geez, the listing agent should have read through it. Sure, I agree with you. And you could possibly up your practice on how you submit offers. And I could simply put it in and say, hey, Jay, here's an offer on 123 Main. As you can see, the purchase price is X. Please note the escalation clause referenced on page 7 that does say the buyer is willing to pay up to X amount. Okay, the more communication, the better. Don't search for gotcha moments in these. Search for moments to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then notice and delivery talks about notice and delivery are unilateral communications. They will be delivered to the information that's given on this document, which on the last page, it has the contact information for the agents involved. Paragraph 30 basically is a disclaimer on a couple of different things. One, you could be surveilled when you're looking at property or when you're inspecting property. So be careful on that. If you are going to surveil your property as a seller, you need to make sure you follow the guidelines. Also says that you want to make sure that you are reviewing, reading, and going through any of the contract. And if you have any legal questions, you'll ask an attorney. And then expiration of the offer. This is, hey, I'm submitting the offer. If the offer will expire automatically if no action is taken by either party 30 calendar days. So if you don't have one on there, that's where that would come in. And then you have all the signed information on it. All right. Let's see, I have one in here. Can we not do the financing contingency together? Yeah, Lauren, let's get together. We can talk about that. I can't do it right after this. I do have an appointment, but shoot me an email. We'll jump on and be able to chat about that for sure. All right, what other questions do you have? So this will be recorded. Watch it and keep coming back to these. I'm telling you 3 things I told you today. One of them was something we had never experienced before. And they're new to come up on this. 2 of them are very rare occasions on some of the examples I gave today. So I really encourage you. I know that this may not be the most exciting topic for a lot of you. I love this topic. I think contracts are fascinating. I also think it's a huge part of our value proposition. I've always said that, you know, one of the best ways to gain your client's confidence is to be able to explain this contract in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And when we're in a highly emotional market right now. And if things start coming up quickly and you're not able to explain the contract, again, you don't have to explain it word for word. And you'll never lose a client to say, you know what, my interpretation is this, but let me double check with my broker really quickly. You'll never lose a client from that. Giving them answers that just to give them answers though, they will see right through that. So just be careful on that. It's really, really good to know this. And there are no dumb contract questions. And I will also say the more you know on the contract, the less opportunity you have for emergencies. So just be careful on those. There are not many real estate emergencies. However, I know in this market, when you're getting into bidding wars and things like that, if you're trying to do that with a contract you're not super familiar with, that can be stressful. So, all right. If you have no more questions, then y'all have fun. We'll see you next Tuesday at 2. All right, guys. Thank you.